May 6, 1945. A cold, relentless rain hammered the red brick streets of Reims, France. In a modest schoolhouse that had once echoed with children's laughter, the fate of the entire world now hung in the balance. This was supreme headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force, SHAEF. Outside, military police stood like statues in the downpour. Inside, the air was thick with cigarette smoke, the smell of wet wool, and the kind of tension that makes grown men check their watches every 30 seconds. For generals from America, Britain, the Soviet Union, and France waited in a converted classroom. They sipped terrible coffee. They stared at maps that showed the German army in total collapse. And they waited. Then a staff car splashed to a stop. Out stepped a man who looked every inch the Prussian aristocrat, tall, ramrod straight, iron cross gleaming on his chest. Colonel General Alfred Jodl, Chief of Operations for the German High Command, the man who had spent 6 years turning Hitler's darkest orders into military reality. The man who had signed the directives to bomb London into rubble, to launch the invasion of the Soviet Union, to execute captured commandos on sight. He walked into that schoolhouse with his head high, boots clicking on the tile floor, convinced he was about to be treated like a respected adversary. He expected to sit across from General Dwight D. Eisenhower himself. He expected brandy, cigars, and a soldier's peace. He was about to learn just how wrong a man could be. Because Eisenhower was in his office down the hall. And when he heard Jodl had arrived, he didn't move. He didn't stand. He didn't even glance toward the door. Instead, he looked at his aide and spoke words that would echo through history. "I will not see him. I will not speak to him. And I will not shake his hand. Tell him he is here to sign. Nothing more." That single sentence shattered the last illusion the Germans had left. To understand why Eisenhower refused to even look at Jodl, we have to go back just a few days. Adolf Hitler was already dead, shot himself in his Berlin bunker on April 30th. But the Nazi regime didn't die with him. It mutated, like a virus trying to survive. Hitler had named Grand Admiral Karl Donitz as his successor. Donitz set up a ghost government in the small northern town of Flensburg, right on the Danish border. He still believed Germany had cards to play. He still believed he could drive a wedge between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union. His plan was as cold as it was desperate: surrender to the Americans and British in the West, but keep fighting the Russians in the East just long enough to evacuate as many German soldiers and civilians as possible from the Red Army's path. Donitz called Jodl to his headquarters. "Go to Eisenhower," he said. "Talk. Delay. Buy us time. Every hour you keep them talking is another hour we can pull our troops out of the East." Jodl agreed. He packed his uniform, polished his medals, and flew to Reims convinced he was walking into a negotiation between equals. He had no idea Eisenhower had been waiting for this moment for 3 brutal years. But before Jodl even arrived, the Germans sent a test balloon. Admiral Hans-Georg von Friedberg showed up on May 5 expecting polite conversation and perhaps a decent meal. Instead, he was led into a small plain room lined with maps that showed the German front lines disintegrating like wet paper. Waiting for him was Eisenhower's chief of staff, General Walter Bedell Smith, nicknamed Beetle, a man with a volcanic temper, a bleeding ulcer, and zero tolerance for Nazis. Friedberg tried his prepared speech: "We wish to surrender our forces in the north, but we must continue fighting in the east. The Russians are unpredictable." Bedell Smith didn't even blink. "Unconditional surrender. All fronts. East and west. At the same time. No exceptions." Friedberg turned pale. He argued. He pleaded. Then, in front of hardened Allied officers, the German admiral broke down and began to cry. He admitted he didn't even have the authority to sign anything meaningful. He was just a messenger. Smith stared at him with open disgust. "Then get on the radio. Tell Donitz to send someone who actually matters. And tell him to hurry." 24 hours later, Jodl arrived. He stepped into the war room, a former classroom with a large ping-pong table covered by a green army blanket. No flags, no ceremony, just maps and cold eyes. Jodl looked around, chin raised. "Where is General Eisenhower?" he demanded. The American officer answered flatly, "The Supreme Commander is not available. You will deal with General Smith." Jodl's face tightened. He outranked Smith. He was a colonel general. This was an insult. But the real insult was still waiting down the hall. Because Eisenhower stayed behind his closed door the entire time. He refused to breathe the same air as the man who had helped murder millions. It was deliberate. It was personal. And it was about to get much, much worse. Jodl sat down at that green-covered table and played his final card. "We are prepared to surrender to the Western Allies," he said smoothly. "But we cannot order our troops in the East to lay down their arms. They are terrified of the Red Army. If we command them to surrender immediately, many will simply ignore the order and keep fighting. Give us 48 hours to withdraw our forces from the Soviet front. Then we will sign." It was a clever trap. 48 hours to save the best remaining panzer divisions. 48 hours to create a permanent split between America and Russia. 48 hours to keep the dream of a future Nazi revival alive. Bedell Smith listened without expression. Then he stood up, walked down the hall, and told Eisenhower exactly what Jodl had proposed. Eisenhower stopped pacing. His face went hard as stone. He gave an order that would break the German will once and for all. And when Smith walked back into that room and delivered it, the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Smith stood over Jodl like a judge delivering sentence. He didn't sit. He didn't soften his voice. He simply repeated Eisenhower's words with surgical precision. "The Supreme Commander says no. No delays. No phased surrender. No 48 hours. No deals of any kind. You will sign unconditional surrender, every front, every army, every weapon, right now. Or Eisenhower will close the Western Front completely." Jodl's eyes narrowed. "Close the front?" "Yes," Smith said. "Not a single German soldier, not a single truck, not a single civilian will be allowed to cross our lines. We will seal the border. Your people fleeing the Red Army will be turned back. They will have nowhere to go." The room went dead silent. Everyone understood what that meant. By early May 1945, millions of German civilians, women, children, elderly, along with shattered Wehrmacht units were streaming west, desperate to escape Soviet revenge. Stories of mass executions, forced labor columns, and burning villages had already reached the west. If Eisenhower shut the door, those people would be trapped in a shrinking pocket between two merciless fronts. The humanitarian catastrophe would be unimaginable. Jodl's aristocratic mask cracked for the first time. Sweat appeared on his forehead despite the chilly room. He understood the mathematics of defeat better than most. He knew the panzer divisions he wanted to save were already ghosts, low on fuel, out of ammunition, surrounded. The 48 hours he begged for wouldn't save an army. It would only doom millions more civilians. He tried one last maneuver. "I must consult Admiral Donitz. I need to radio Flensburg." Smith nodded curtly. "You have permission. But make it quick." Jodl was escorted to a communications room. He dictated a coded message that carried the weight of finality. Eisenhower demands immediate, total, unconditional surrender on all fronts. Threatens to seal Western lines and refuse all further German crossings. No room for negotiation. Request urgent authorization to sign. The reply did not come quickly. Hours dragged. The war room filled with the smell of stale coffee and overflowing ashtrays. Allied officers watched Jodl like hawks. He sat rigid, staring at the green tablecloth, the iron cross on his chest now looking more like a relic than a badge of honor. Finally, just after midnight, the coded response arrived. Donitz had read the situation correctly. There was no escape left. Permission granted. Sign. At 2:41 a.m. on May 7, 1945, the cameras were rolled in. Bright lights snapped on. Reporters climbed onto chairs for a better view. The ping-pong table had become the altar of history. Jodl sat on one side, flanked by the broken Admiral von Friedberg. Opposite him, General Walter Bedell Smith representing Eisenhower, a French general, and a Soviet general whose face showed no emotion at all. A short document was placed before Jodl. Act of military surrender. No flowery language. No room for interpretation. We the undersigned, acting by authority of the German High Command, hereby surrender unconditionally to the Supreme Commander, Allied Expeditionary Force and simultaneously to the Supreme High Command of the Red Army all forces on land, at sea and in the air who are at this date under German control. Jodl picked up the fountain pen. For a heartbeat his hand hesitated, barely noticeable, but the cameras caught it. Then he signed. Alfred Jodl. Clean, precise strokes. The others followed. Smith. The Frenchman. The Russian. In less than 5 minutes, the European War, the war that had consumed 60 million lives, redrawn continents, and shattered generations, was formally ended with ink on paper. Jodl set the pen down. He stood. He adjusted his tunic as if preparing for a parade. Then, in careful English, he spoke. Gentlemen, with this signature, the German people and the German armed forces are delivered, for better or worse, into the hands of the victors. He paused, searching for something in their faces. Sympathy. Understanding. He continued. In this war, which has lasted more than 5 years, both sides have achieved and suffered more than perhaps any other peoples in the world. It was a plea wrapped in philosophy. He spoke of German suffering. He never mentioned the death camps. He never mentioned the 6 million Jews. He never mentioned the millions of Soviet civilians starved, shot, burned. He stood there, the chief architect of so much calculated horror, and asked, in effect, for the victors to see both sides. The room froze. No one moved. No one spoke. The Allied officers stared back with faces carved from granite. Jodl waited for a nod, a murmur, anything. Nothing came. He realized then that no speech, no posture, no iron cross would buy him dignity here. He snapped a salute, turned to leave. But before he reached the door, an American officer stepped forward. General Jodl. Supreme Commander Eisenhower will see you now. Jodl straightened instantly. A flicker of hope crossed his face. Soldier to soldier. Perhaps now, in private, respect would be shown. He was led down the hallway to Eisenhower's office. The door opened. Eisenhower stood behind his desk, tall, broad-shouldered, radiating quiet authority. He did not smile. He did not offer a chair. And most critically, he did not extend his hand. To a German officer of Jodl's generation, a handshake was sacred. It sealed honor between warriors. By withholding it, Eisenhower delivered the final, devastating message. You are not my equal. You are not a gentleman. You are a criminal. Eisenhower's voice was calm, cold steel. General Jodl, do you understand the terms you have just signed? Jodl. You understand that all German forces must cease fire immediately? That any violation will be treated as a breach and punished accordingly? Jodl. Eisenhower held his gaze for a long, punishing moment. That is all. Dismissed like a subordinate caught stealing. No farewell. No recognition. Jodl saluted again. Eisenhower returned the barest nod, enough to observe military courtesy. Nothing more. Guards escorted Jodl out. The arrogance that had carried him into the building was gone. His shoulders sagged. The man who had orchestrated 6 years of aggression walked away looking small. Back in Eisenhower's office, the champagne corks had not yet popped, but the mood had already shifted from iron tension to quiet triumph. Staff officers gathered around the Supreme Commander, shaking hands, slapping shoulders, voices low but electric with relief. Eisenhower sat at his desk, the 2 gold fountain pens used to sign the victory message resting in front of him like trophies. He picked them up, held them crossed in a perfect V shape, and smiled, that famous wide, genuine Ike smile that photographers had waited years to capture again. Flashbulbs popped. The image would circle the world, the man who had led the liberation of Europe marking victory not with speeches, but with simple geometry. His staff had prepared long, soaring drafts for the official announcement to Washington and London. Paragraphs filled with phrases like, "The forces of freedom have triumphed over the forces of tyranny," and "A new dawn for humanity." Eisenhower read them silently, then shook his head. "Too many words," he said. He took a fresh sheet of paper and wrote 5 sentences. 5 plain, powerful sentences that would become one of the most famous military dispatches in history. The mission of this Allied force was fulfilled at 0241, local time, May 7, 1945. Nothing more. No poetry. No flourish. Just the truth. The surrender at Reims was never meant to be the final act. The document Jodl signed was rushed to Berlin so the Soviet High Command could stage their own formal ceremony the following day. On May 8, in a ruined Karlshorst suburb, Field Marshal Keitel signed an identical instrument in front of Zhukov and other Soviet commanders. The world would celebrate VE Day on the 8th. But the real ending, the moment the Nazi leadership's last illusion of dignity died, happened in that smoky French schoolhouse at 2:41 a.m. What became of the men who stood in that room? Admiral von Friedberg, the one who had broken down in tears during the preliminary talks, could not bear the shame. 2 weeks later he walked into a bathroom, swallowed poison, and ended his life. Alfred Jodl returned to Flensburg believing he had at least preserved some shred of military honor. He was wrong. Within days the entire Donitz government was arrested. Jodl was placed in custody, then transferred to Nuremberg. There, in the same courtroom where the world judged the surviving Nazi leadership, he faced charges of war crimes, crimes against peace, and crimes against humanity. The prosecution presented mountains of evidence. The Commissar order, the night and fog decree, the execution of commandos, the systematic terror in occupied territories. Jodl defended himself calmly, insisting he was only a soldier following orders. The tribunal disagreed. On October 1, 1946, he was sentenced to death. On October 16, he was hanged. The man who signed the surrender ended at the end of a rope. Eisenhower walked out of that schoolhouse a different man. The strain of command had aged him, but the victory restored something essential. He would go on to become Supreme Commander of NATO, then President of the United States, twice. The leader who refused to shake a Nazi's hand became the face of the free world for a generation. The refusal to offer Jodl a handshake was more than a personal slight. It was a deliberate moral line drawn in history. By denying the German general the courtesies of rank and the rituals of warrior respect, Eisenhower declared that this war had not been a contest between honorable armies. It had been a crusade against a criminal regime that had violated every code of civilization. The Nazis were not defeated opponents to be saluted. They were defendants awaiting judgment. Some historians still argue Eisenhower could have been more diplomatic, that a handshake might have eased post-war tensions or projected magnanimity. Most who study the moment disagree. In 1945, after Auschwitz, after Babi Yar, after the death marches and the liberated camps still reeking of horror, diplomacy would have felt like betrayal. Eisenhower chose clarity over courtesy. He chose justice over gesture. And in doing so, he gave the Allied victory something deeper than territory or treaties. He gave it moral weight. That small red brick schoolhouse in Reims stands today as a quiet museum. The ping-pong table is gone. The green cloth is gone. But the room still feels heavy with what happened there. A fountain pen, a closed door, 5 words on a piece of paper, and one withheld handshake ended the nightmare of the Third Reich. Not with thunder. Not with fanfare. With silence, resolve, and ink. If this story of the final hours moved you, if it reminded you why some lines must never be crossed, drop a like, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more untold chapters from the Second World War. We've got stories coming that will keep you watching until the very last second. Thank you for staying with us to the end.